So I think we'll kick off here. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us for this New York Climate Week webinar. So this session is Melting the Poles, why broad public engagement is so critical for overcoming polarisation and how it can build the mandate for climate action. I'm delighted to be joined by Climate Outreach's founder, George Marshall. Just before I pass over to George to kick the session off, a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar, as with all Climate Outreach webinars, is recorded. We're going to have a Q&A discussion session. We'd really like to make this a dialogue towards the end. So George's presentation is going to last about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes at the end to open it out and discuss. And we'd love to hear from all of you. If you will be coming and speaking or asking any questions and you would like to remain anonymous, when you are asking a question in the Q&A box, please just tick the box that says stay anonymous, and then you won't appear on the recording. That will then be uploaded to the Climate Outreach website and to YouTube, and then to be shared afterwards for those who couldn't make it today. Again, just for our pass over to George for the section at the end, and we'll recap this. If you have any questions, as we're talking, drop that either in the chat here or in the Q&A box, and we can pick those up afterwards. Or if you would like to contribute, if you just write the word contribute in the chat box, I'll keep a log of that, and then when we go into the Q&A session, we will invite you in individually to speak. So over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Joel. And as Joel was saying, I hope this isn't just going to be me talking at you. I'm sure that in the room we have people with a lot of experience, and we would very much like to hear from you. So we do welcome contributions at the end. Now, there's always a danger that something might go funny with this, but Joel, are we up and running?
Looks good to me.
Okay. Apologies for a really long title. I tried to get all of the keywords in there. We're going to be talking about public engagement. Engagement as being more than just simply communications. Engagement being a two-way process whereby we enter into a dialogue with people, which is important to say that this is different from a kind of a government information approach to communications. Why it's critical meaning absolutely essential. For overcoming polarization, we're going to talk about this somewhat, and building a mandate, and then a great deal that I'm going to say about building the mandate. I guess the starting point where I really want to start is this, and this is an understated but really important component. People have a fundamental right to know. People have a right to know about climate change, about what's causing it and how it will affect their lives. And we haven't spoken enough about engagement as a right. It's a right which is a human right, and there's an interesting dialogue establishing in human rights institutions now about the right to hold information. It's a moral right. I think we can make the claim that people who don't know can't make informed decisions, and therefore actually a lack of information is an impact multiplier. That's to say, if you're building a house in a floodplain, if you're planting the wrong kind of crops, if you're taking the wrong kind of jobs, then the impacts of climate change will greatly multiplied on you. But people also have a legal right to know. This is, again, understated, in fact, very rarely known or recognized. The Convention on Climate Change has an entire article, Article 6, dedicated to the commitment of governments, the binding commitments of governments to educate, to create awareness, and, importantly, to enable public participation. I have to say this has been deplorably under-enforced. There is a process within the international negotiations for this. It is very weak. It has very low status. It is very underfunded. There are no criteria for enforcement. There is no monitoring process that is adequate, really, for the implementation of this. But this has also been repeated in the Paris Agreement and in many other agreements too, in the Doha Agreement. So governments have made a binding commitment to inform and to educate their citizens and to engage them in policy. And the simple fact of the matter is they have not implemented that. And there are, of course, quite legitimate demands coming from grassroots protests to say, look, we want to be told what's going on. Tell the truth. This was Extinction Rebellion occupying Oxford Circus in the centre of London with their pink boat. Tell the truth. And I think it's fair to say that people have not been told the truth. Or actually, more importantly, people have really not been told very much at all. And that for 30 years, we have underinformed and undereducated people. part of the reason we now have such a strong youth movement is because young people have to some degree been educated in school curricula, but the vast majority of the population, especially in the countries that will have the largest climate impacts, have far too little idea of what is coming down the line, and that is a moral problem. I think from a policy point of view, we need to assert that we will not be able to achieve the targets for 1.5 or 2 degrees, or actually really any of the targets we have on the table at the moment, unless there is a public mandate for action. Mandate meaning that across the board, across the entire, all of the demographics and the parts of society, there is an agreement and a mandate, a permission for politicians to take strong and necessary action. By the way, Joel, if anything goes wrong with my sound, please butt in and tell me. I like this picture. This from Australia. I mean, it is clear that in most countries, especially countries with a polarized situation, there is not a broad-based mandate. This was the response to the Australian carbon pricing policy, which was one of a number of factors which brought down the government. And we've seen similar resistance, for example, with the Gilets jaunes protests in France. These are always complex. It's never simply about carbon pricing or about climate change. But I think that what is important here is that climate change and climate policies become attached to wider areas of disagreement and dissent. And part of the reason for that is because people are not yet sufficiently bought into the fact that climate change and action on this is something which supersedes, which goes above and beyond their own party and political allegiances and identities. But this is something which spreads across society. In other words, there is no broad-based mandate for action. In the face of it, there is no real opportunity, therefore, to having sustained policy action, because we see this flip-flop happening between governments, which you in the US have repeatedly seen, but all around the world indeed. Polarization is a threat. I would argue it's the greatest threat to building this mandate. And again, there's been a tendency, I've been working on this issue a long time now, there's been a tendency to assume that polarization is going to lessen, but over time, the overwhelming evidence of people's own experience, the overwhelming body of scientific evidence will in the end start to sweep things along, that climate denial will slip away and wither. Well, to some extent that happens. I mean, the level of outright denial of saying climate change doesn't exist is now quite low. But that does not mean, however, that the level of buy-in and support for strong climate action is significantly rising. Indeed, it's still polarized and in some ways getting more polarizing. This was a significant paper done by Matthew Hornsey and a team, I think at University of Queensland, and useful because it's looking across many countries, over 56 countries. Looking at what are the major demographic things affecting people's attitudes on climate change. So you'll see that age is significant. The reason it's below the bar is because it's inversely proportional. In other words, young people are significantly more concerned than older people. So we have a degree of polarization, which I believe over time may create actually significant generational tensions. But the primary source of polarization, as we can see here, is around political affiliation and ideology. What's significant is this is across many, many countries. It is a consistent pattern. Of course, as we know in the US, it is extremely polarized. This was some years ago now, but a particularly powerful piece of research during the Obama administration, which showed that apart from attitudes on Obama, climate change was the most politically polarized issue of all, ahead of gun control, abortion, death penalty. That in itself, I think, is very significant, and that has been repeated in subsequent research. Here's something more recent, and this is a grave concern, I feel. On the face of it, there appears to be a balanced support for the Green New Deal within the US. We can see that the opinion of opposition is more vehement, but it appears to sit in the middle. However, as soon as you conduct a voter intention basis to this, you find an enormous disparity between the Democrats, remember green here is showing supporting it, and Republicans here, black meaning opposing it. This is a phenomenal split. And again, there are many, many reasons for this, But the fact is, it is there. And the fact is that with this degree of opposition, it is hard to see how the Green New Deal in its current form could be sustained politically, because at some time or other, even if it gets through, it's likely to face a shift in government. There's not a broad-based mandate for this action. Canada, intense polarization on carbon pricing, which was a major issue in recent federal elections, as you here see the right here strongly opposing, the left, well, a third of the right strongly opposing, a third of the left strongly supporting. This is international as well. Australia, as we've already said, significant splits. Canada, my own country, the UK, there is a split. We have it as binding legislation. Every government in Britain, whether left-wing or right-wing, strongly supports climate action, and yet it still exists there. Germany, since this research was done, far more pronounced, because now in Germany, which always used to be a relatively unpolarized situation, we now have the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is far right, and they have adopted climate denial as an aspect of their mobilizing ideology. And across Europe as a whole, we're seeing a rise of populist parties, generally far right, but do not assume that this is a matter which necessarily has to be left or right. There is plenty of space for far left populist parties to oppose climate change. And indeed, there has in the past been people on the left who have been strongly opposed to climate action on social justice issues. But here, what is worrying here is that these countries listed here on the left of the bar, Austria, Denmark, my own country, Great Britain, Netherlands, Sweden, countries which have strong climate policies, have populist movements in those countries that are strongly opposed to climate action. This gets particularly severe, I think, in countries where those parties are quite strong, like, for example, Austria, or increasingly, say, in Germany, where the Alternative for Deutschland is the second or third largest party in the Bundestag. So what creates this polarization? How did we get into this situation? I think we need to ask this question in order to understand how we can build a broad-based mandate. We have to somehow, first of all, we have to recognize what is happening here so we do not continue to feed it. And then we have to put in place for the basis for overcoming it. I think the first thing to say is this has been developing over a long time. In the early 90s and the late 80s and the early 90s, when climate change emerged as an issue, there was relatively little difference between left and right. Even in the US, the difference was largely based on people's scientific education and their awareness of this issue. Whether they were aware, if they were aware, they tended to support action regardless of politics. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher, a right-wing free market politician, strongly supported action on climate change and spoke repeatedly about it at her party conservative conferences. So this has been developing over the past 30 years. And for this reason, we need to recognize that we're not going to be able to put it straight back immediately. We're in for the long haul on this. We have lost a generation and we're going to have to get back to it. I've spoken about this in my own book, Don't Even Think About It, which speaks at some length about the development of this and why it happened. I also recommend my colleagues, Dr. Adam Corner and Jamie Clark, also address these issues of climate communications in their book, Talking Climate. And of course, there are some excellent books. I recommend Naomi Oreskes and James Hogan's book on part of the reason why we have this polarization, which is a very active, well-funded, professional disinformation campaign which has been running over the past 20, 30 years. And I don't want to minimize the importance of that. I think, however, what is important to recognize, though, is that it moved into a vacuum that had been created by existing climate communications. In other words, the space had existed within which one could seed misinformation. And part of the process for this has been one of group identification. So to take a step back, group identification of saying who you are and what you identify with is defined both by saying this is my in-group, this is the group of people who I share values, identity, life experience, and worldview with. And this is a group who is not my in-group, my out-group. These are the people who are different from me and with whom I do not identify. And people's sense of identity and who they are is defined by these two things. This is me, this is who I am, this is who I am not. In polarized situations, of course, we're seeing this particularly strongly in in the US at the moment, but in many countries. We're seeing it in Britain, where we've had a very bitter fight over Brexit. People are identifying themselves as much by who they are not as by who they are. Take this toxic polarization and feed a new issue like climate change into it, and we can see that we have a problem. Environmentalists, I'm a proud environmentalist. You will see from my CV, I was the former director of forest campaigns for Greenpeace US. I've worked for many organizations in the US. I lived in the US for many years. I feel that we have made a serious mistake strategically by failing to recognize the need, the essential need to reach outside political boundaries and to reach across entire populations. But I go so far as to say that we actively alienate conservatives. This banner, by the way, was on the climate march, which I was delighted to attend, 500,000 people on the streets of New York. There was not a single banner, there was not a single sign or placard from all of those people there indicating that conservatives or people of conservative values would be welcomed or accepted. There was a very large number of banners saying that they were absolutely despised. This has been a pattern for 30 years and has led what I believe to this positive feedback loop. That what happened at the beginning was that left-wing identity dominated, which environmentalists, of course, are across the political spectrum, but have a tendency towards the liberal side. But they started to shape the narratives in terms of their own identity. Conservatives started to reject that. People with an interest in opposing climate action moved into that space. The conservative identity became more associated with opposing rather than accepting climate change and taking action. And then, very importantly, conservatives who did accept that climate change was a problem started to suppress their own voice out of fear that it was out of tune with their colleagues and the people in their social group. So this active suppression, which goes on now, continues now. A third or more of conservatives are concerned about climate change and are clearly not verbalizing that. So what happens is the space is left open on the one hand for denial to move in on the right, and on the other hand for climate change to be held on and endlessly promoted as something belonging to the left. This is dangerous and it feeds polarization. A few words about my own organization, and then we'll go back to solutions. So we are 14, 15 years old. We have a team of over 20 across multiple disciplines. As I've already said, I come from a background in environmental advocacy. Many of my colleagues have social research, academic backgrounds, people from human rights backgrounds. We've worked right across the board. We've really been fascinated and have focused our work on how do we speak to audiences that are not currently engaged? How do we reach out wider? How do we build this broad social mandate for action? And that's reflected. We work with a very wide range of parties and stakeholders. These are some of the higher profile and we could say more blue chip ones, but we're very happy to work with Fridays for the Future, with environmental organizations, because we think for change, our model of change is you have to have people working at all levels, pushing ahead. And we produce large numbers of reports. Please do have a look at our website and you can see more about our work, and please subscribe to our newsletter. We regularly report our research and our findings. Of particular interest is a large body of work, I believe the largest body of work outside North America, on how do we communicate with people on the right of the political spectrum. I should say in the world of communications research, North America is outstanding. North America has done very good work and you have some very good organizations working there. But this is unusual. I can't put a figure on it, but I would estimate probably around 3/4 of the research work that has been done on climate communications, how to communicate climate change, has been conducted in North America. Once you get in beyond the richer countries, including Europe, for example, and the more developed countries, you find very, very little research. So there's an enormous inequality in research. And that's a problem when it comes to speaking with new audiences. I should also highlight my colleagues working on visuals. Visuals too can bring people together or can polarize people. And we have an entire program identifying effective communications that work, which are tested across a wide range of people from different backgrounds, finding what language works and what language visually does not work. So let's say, what is strong communications, then how do we apply this to this issue of overcoming polarization? Well, it's very important to say, and I've been saying this already, I guess, in the presentation, that climate change and attitudes on climate change is primarily not shaped by the scientific data. It is underpinned by the scientific data, so I don't want to say to my scientific colleagues that their work is not extremely important. Our whole understanding is built on that. But the communications itself is created around narratives. Narratives built around people's identity and their values, and then received and distributed and conveyed by communicators. The attitudes and shape and form that people take on climate change is in the form of a narrative received from people they trust, or, as I've already said, where people are defining themselves by what they are not, that it is shaped and formed by the narrative of people they do not trust, to which point they then move away. This is supported by a large body of research. This statement here is part of the work that we shared with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have been advising the IPCC for some years, and we would say to scientists, there's a scientific base for climate change, and there's a scientific base for climate change communications. This statement I have here, you know, a literature review support that would start to look like that, and then I kind of got bored doing it a lot, basically. And what we can break this down further, and we can say what this might look like is the following: that good communications validates who people are. This is who you are, you're important. It reflects what they care about. It shows them that other people within their social group agree with what they're saying. Because the reward for taking action on climate change is an enhanced sense of identification. You become more a part of your group, and the world around you becomes more the way you would like it to be. That the things you're concerned about are dealt with, and the things that you would like it to be become enhanced. What's important about this formulation is it's going to be different for people of different values. That people's identity is going to be reflected differently, but what is important to them is going to be different, and the way they want the world to be will be different. And therefore, we need to generate a template for different audiences according to their different identities, what they're concerned about, and how they wish the world to be. Essentially, the heuristic, the shortcut that we use for evaluating incoming information is whether we trust the people who are telling us. And the primary quality of trusted messengers is that they are people like ourselves. So part of a reason we see this polarization is because we do not have adequate trusted communicators across the spectrum. We have far disproportionately large number of communicators from one side of a political spectrum. We have far too few from the other side, and we have far too many on the conservative side who are undermining and denying climate change. This imbalance, people look at it and they go, well, I don't know whether it's right or not, but you know what, these people over here I trust. There seem to be a lot of them telling me that it isn't true. These people over here, there seem to be a lot who are saying it is true, and I don't trust them. So really, communications, we would argue, starts with the communicator as the essential component. And the fact is, conservatives don't trust environmentalists. I think this is fair to say. They trust them in some areas. They trust them for their commitment, maybe for their moral integrity. But there are repeatedly, and we do a lot of focus groups on this, including focus groups in America, we know that they are not trusted, that they're seen as exaggerating and not reliable, especially when it comes to speaking about economics. So when the environmental sources come out and say there will be, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of new jobs in the green economy or in transition, that is generally speaking not trusted. Celebrities are also not trusted. I mean, major problems with having celebrities who, generally speaking, have very rich and entitled lifestyles leading as climate communicators. And we've seen repeatedly, and I show here particularly in Australia, with that there have been problems of using communicators as frontline communicators. I should also warn against using big business as a communicator. There's an assumption that somehow business and big business opportunity speaks well to people on the right. That is not the case. Grassroots conservatives are skeptical of the interests of large corporations. What does work is talking about workers, small businesses, people building their businesses, telling their own story, saying, you know, I'm so proud of what I've achieved with my life. I've employed people from my local community, from my solar company, for my insulation company. These kinds of stories are extremely effective across the board, and we know that because we've tested it. This was a program a while ago from the state of Wisconsin. Sadly, we've seen far too little of this kind of approach, and this was from some years back. But what they did was they got identifiable citizens of Wisconsin telling their own story in their own words. And even if you didn't identify the person who was telling it to you, you could, without any question, recognize the authenticity of their voice. This word authenticity is so important. We have to get authentic communications where we can see and trust that the person telling us these things is really speaking from their own experience. In the UK, we've had a program which has been running for some years now called For the Love Of, and Climate Outreach helped to design this. For the Love Of was a program where people speak about what they're concerned about with climate change, the things that they love, and their worries that these things might be affected or destroyed by climate change. And we tested this. I think this was the first time anybody had tested communications with groups that were outside the green bubble, with groups that were conservative, which might be skeptical. And on the basis of this, we recommended that this was effective, and it has been. It's been used by a coalition of groups working on climate change to open doors. It's been very effective with open doors politically with conservative governments because it's authentic. People are talking about what they like, what they love, what's important to them, not speaking from an ideology, but speaking from their heart, from their life experience. And again, because we tested it, we know this works extremely well. And that what is good about this is that it creates this shared mandate. It creates a shared sense that we're all working together, that we all care about different things, but we care about things and we can come together. So let's unpack a little bit some of the center-right issues. Left-wing people tend to quite wrongly assume that conservatives are not compassionate. I think it's fair to say, and there's quite a lot of research on this, that people of the left tend to hugely underestimate or denigrate the values of conservatives. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of excellent documentation analyzing attitudes towards and value systems on the right. I think Jonathan Haidt is probably very well known in the US. And this, for example, from focus groups is when we ask people who are conservatives about their values, these are the words which come to mind. Not making money, not getting rich, not stamping on the poor, not getting rid of immigrants, not any of the things which liberals tend to think are conservative values. Integrity, loyalty, helping, open-mindedness. So if we're speaking to people on the right, these are the values we need to enshrine in communications. And we can do this, we can map these out quite carefully, and our research contains a lot of this material of how do we map out people's values so that they're hearing stuff which speaks to who they are. So let's start looking in the last few minutes at language that we know can build this popular mandate. First of all, we need to break out of this idea that climate change is all about environment. In fact, climate change really should never have been thought about as an environmental biggie, environmental issue, because it covers so many different bases. Part of the problem we have is that environmental organizations, if it's covered by environmental organizations, environmental correspondents in the media, secretaries or ministers of the environment and so on. But we have to break out of that box. Start talking about health in particular, works across the political spectrum. Security does too, though we've got to be careful here because security, people on the right are very skeptical of people on the left talking about security. But security, economy, food, but other things too, which are much more, again, on the right. Family, faith, heritage, fairness, independence. I'll touch on some of those points. So first of all, break out of the environmental box. Then there's a way that people who are conservative often use language which really works well. Re-words we find repeatedly used in focus groups when people of right-wing values are talking about what's important to them. This is Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper was himself actually very skeptical of climate change and climate change policy. But let's recognize the language he's using. Re-words, because re-words are about going back to core values and asserting them. But the reason I mention this is because re-words also work across the political spectrum. If we use this language, it tests well with left as well as right. Here was a program, for example, we put together for an organization of Britain of conservative evangelicals of talking about climate change framed as renewing, restoring. And this program worked very well. It tested well, and it's been very successful for them. Preparing. We shouldn't really be talking about climate change in terms of adaptation. I kind of hate this word. We should be talking about preparing. Climate change is coming down the line. Let's prepare for it so we can protect and defend the people who are important to us. We know, and we've tested this widely. At the moment, there's a program actually in British Columbia and Canada which is using this language that we've recommended, and again, deliberately to try and build a common sense of shared purpose and shared mandate that crosses what are quite considerable political ideological boundaries. We know that if we talk about climate change in the sense of how people are going to come together to care for each other and to care for their community. If we say, for example, you remember that flood we had, you remember those fires we had, you remember how we came together as a community, how we cared for each other, how we supported each other. Well, there's more coming down the line. We need to be ready for it so we can protect and care for the people. But this language works very, very well. In other words, we ground our response to climate change within a validation of people's sense of community and coming together. I've interviewed people across major climate impact areas. I did a lot of interviews following Hurricane Sandy. And what people want to talk about is how proud they are of their community and how people have come together and how strong and vindicated they feel in their community identity. So that is the place within which we put that language. COVID and the response to COVID has also created a sense that people will come together when they face shared and common adversity. And we'll have to see how it pans out because it could go in any number of directions. But I'm really hoping that COVID will create the precedent and the space within which we can say, come together. We've shown that we can come together as a community, a country, as a world when we face a common threat. And we're building on that precedent. Climate Outreach has done a lot of work on communicating carbon pricing. We're lead advisors to the World Bank on this, and we're currently working with a number of governments on how to communicate. I'm so sorry, I was getting a message there. On how to communicate carbon pricing. In Canada, for example, we found the best way of doing it is around language of fairness. Fairness being a core Canadian value. Carbon pricing is a fair way to share responsibility. We know this language works because we have tested it in focus groups and in surveys across the Canadian population, trying to find the sweet spot for language which is liked by people on more liberal bent who support climate action, but is also supported by people on the center right who might be a bit concerned about climate change, but might intuitively reject messaging coming from the left. This language hit that spot, language around fairness. But of course, that's Canada. In every country, in every situation, we're going to find there's a different context. Faith and faith identities are also a strong basis for reaching across boundaries. Faiths are huge networks of people with shared values and identity. And although I recognize that there are a big difference between people within faiths, the fact that they have a common shared sense of identity and values is a way of speaking wider. We have done a lot of work on this, and please look at our website for more of that. For example, within Islamic values, we found that language around climate change as a damage to the gift given to us by God. And by the way, this gift language works across all of the faiths, the major world faiths. It was a very powerful way of framing and talking about climate change. In other words, could be the basis of a conversation which works across these boundaries and brings people together with a shared sense of identity and shared values. Language is powerful if we hit the right language. Finally, we can talk about national identities. I believe passionately that we can talk about a national identity without being nationalist. People have a really strong need to feel part of a place, and many people can be proud of where they live without being nationalistic and opposed to people from other countries. We worked in Wales. I come from Wales. It's a small part of England. It has a distinct language, a distinct identity working with the country there. What's interesting in Wales is that it has a history of fossil fuel production, coal industry. My own family was in were coal miners for 4 generations. And we knew there that we could not go into a conversation around national identity which opposed or denigrated coal production. So the language we tested, which again performed very well across groups, was to talk about coal as a natural resource. Natural resources built our country, and we're rich in natural resources that will meet the new challenges of climate change. In other words, responding to climate change is not a break with the past. We don't say coal is dirty, it's disgusting, it's destroyed the world. We say coal is part of what makes us who we are, but working with natural resources and moving forward is a continuity into transitioning to new energy. We've tested language in many countries around the world. We've worked with people across India, finding language which works in India around shared national values and identity. We've been working across North Africa recently, again, finding language in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Mauritania, in Jordan, that works with shared identities. And we did a great deal of work with a very large project in Alberta. I'm going to be finished in 3 minutes, John. In Alberta, trying to find language there which speaks to a deeply, deeply divided society. How can you talk in a society that is utterly dependent on oil, or certainly an economy that's dependent on oil, about moving out of oil? And the answer is, it's very, very hard. We cannot say that there is that there's a magic bullet. But one thing which we found is that saying it was easy was a major mistake. We needed to say to people, we need to recognize that this will not be easy, but that we are a people who have faced problems before. Consistently, by the way, we find that easy language fails in any country we test it in. People need to be told this is hard, this is challenging, but we can do it. That's the language that they need. And that's the language people respond to. We found, however, that the language which worked best with the settler population in Alberta, which is the large majority of the population, people who moved into the province, was language which did not denigrate the oil industry, but recognized the contribution that it had made, but that there were problems with it. In particular, the problem wasn't of climate change, but the problem was of insecurity in the industry and how different energy sources and economic diversification could create a more secure and stable foundation. But I have to say, it's not easy. This might work with a settler population, but with the indigenous population, there's a very different set of values. So when we find language which reaches across communities, we should not undermine the need for diversity within that, of saying there are within our communities different perspectives on this. Let's welcome and invite them and let's start a conversation. And indeed, in the US, there was a history in the Second World War of talking, for example, about how a unified objective could bring people from across a deeply divided society together, politically and racially. So there is a precedent. The final thing I wanted to say before we go into Q&As is that as Climate Outreach, we have formed a partnership with a number of other organizations. We're not quite ready to launch it yet, but we are working on something called the Climate Engagement Initiative, which will take this need to make public engagement center of climate policy and take it to an international level. Within the UNFCCC, working with national governments and many partners, and particularly, and this is, I guess, what this talk is also about, into the idea space, into the policy space, of saying public engagement is essential. We need to find the best practice and share it and build our work on it. And that we need to demand that governments step up to the mark, that they meet their commitments, that they seriously invest in this. Governments have spent huge amounts of money communicating the threat of terrorism, huge amounts of money communicating around health hazards. Of course, COVID, there's been an enormous public engagement initiative. It is no different for climate change. It needs commensurate levels of investment to really attempt to reach across entire societies so people understand what is going on and why not. And why they need to take action. Because we need an ambition beyond that. Everybody has a fundamental right to know about climate change. They have a right to know what is coming down the line in terms of their own values, their own identity, in a way that they shape their own story, and they can make informed decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. So we're going to move on now to a discussion, and we want this to be a dialogue. those of you who are in the room, I'm sure come from a whole range of backgrounds and interests and ideologies, professions, and we'd love to hear from you, your experiences related to the presentation that George just gave. Either drop your questions into the Q&A function or into the chat, or if you would like to contribute directly, please do just write the word contribute into the chat, and then we can invite you in to talk directly. We have a question to kick us off from DC, who asks, as we moved into more polarized communities, our conservative outreach team, who are comprised of all liberals, are actually finding challenges even finding any conservatives. We don't have any in our social circles and our very liberal city. So how do we even find conservatives? And then on top of that, should we focus on finding conservative groups who already care about climate, or should we look for random conservatives in the wild and try to develop their climate knowledge?
I like this in the wild. It's like going hunting. I'd be interested to know what city this is. I mean, I think the label of conservative is deceptive. If we talk about a spectrum of people with values, we find that there are many people who have small c conservative values who might not identify politically as conservatives. As I said, I've done a lot of work with Muslim communities in Britain. Indeed, in the US, they predominantly vote for Democrat, or in Britain for the Labour Party, but actually in terms of their values, they often have very traditional small c conservative values, and it's those values which are the really important thing. So I would say that there's conservatives everywhere, and that many people on the left often have what we could call conservative values. I'd also say, in terms of this issue of working within networks, I'd say yes. I think it's a matter of opening up a language, a conversation with networks that can reach conservatives. But especially, it's not about going necessarily and engaging with people directly. It's about starting a conversation that enables people to do that internally. Within climate outreach, for example, we have done work in the US with conservative churches. Within Britain, we did a program with Rotary Club. Rotarians are very often conservatives. They are often business owners, older people, really a very strong climate denial skeptical demographic. And we worked then with people within Rotary who were concerned about climate change to help and to train them, to support them, to go and speak to other Rotarians. So I think one of the things on this is not to do first order communications, but second order, to work with networks and work with people who are concerned and want to do things, to help them to go out and to speak with people like themselves. I go back to that point of saying that the communicator is essential. How do we best support and enable communicators to speak to people within their own networks?
Thank you, George. We have a question now from Jen Grebs, who says, at what point do we leave climate deniers behind and wait for policy to force actions?
I mean, I think there's an issue about resources, right? Now, part of the issue of resources, which is why as an organization we want to take this whole thing up a level and start demanding that governments actually take action. It's not because I particularly want the government to do it, but just because they are the ones who have the resources and the capacity to make stuff happen at a larger scale. Similarly, we've got to start a whole conversation within philanthropy about how can we get more resources flowing into public engagement such that we can really start to reach wider. So, however, within a very limited pool, I would recommend not dealing significantly with what we could call deniers, with climate deniers. I don't really like that language, even though in the past I've used it. I don't think, however, in a personal life, in your own personal capacity, if you're dealing with friends or family, I think it's great to engage people, to say, this is what I care about, this is why I care about it. I think, however, on a wider, more strategic level, I think we should be looking for what we could see to be swing constituencies. The significant number, of course, the language of a kind of silent majority has been used and abused politically. But the idea that there is indeed an often silent majority of people concerned about climate change. There are significant numbers of people on the right of a political spectrum who are not speaking out. And those are the people I think that we should really be looking to enable them So this isn't about persuading people or converting people. This is just about helping people who already have a set of views to become more vocal and expressive in terms of what those views are. And again, this should be done on a programmatic basis, working within networks that have strong constituencies. Some of the most interesting work, I think, has been done with suburban women as a group of people who are networked, who often have very community-oriented, small c conservative values in particular, networking around a shared set of values and concerns, often about about the future and the livelihoods for their children. So I think finding the right networks, working through them, and concentrating on this swing constituency. There are always going to be hardcore people who are dissenters, and it's good to have some arguments to deal with them, but that's not the primary focus, I don't think.
Thank you, George. We've got quite a few questions coming in now, so let's move on to a slightly different subject. Yeah, we've got 10 or 15 minutes left. Again, just to reiterate that if anyone wants to join the discussion directly, we would love to hear from you. So just drop into the chat if you would like to make your own point, and we can nominate you in. There's a question here from Stefan Schwardman, who asks, it is really difficult to overcome the separation and polarization. Is there some practical advice on how to continue this journey and be more open, for example, to conservative ideas, especially for people who've never been so open to ideas they usually oppose on an individual level or in conversations?
I think as I was saying earlier on, I tried to prefigure a really important thing on this, which is this is a long haul. This is something which in an ideal world, and again, retrospect is very easy, back in 1990, we would have said, right, we need to make sure at every single step that we are engaging a wide diversity of people. And by the way, by diversity, I mean diversity has to include political diversity, but it also has to include all of the other aspects of diversity. I mean, there's been a tendency not to reach well with communities of color on this, or not to reach well with frontline communities, people who are very affected, for example, with fossil fuel pollution and so on, with air quality issues. So I think this issue of diversity and engagement applies to many aspects of these kind of environmental issues. So it's a longer haul, and I would like to see overcoming polarization being one of the key questions for all forms of political mobilization, of activism, of communications. Sometimes it's necessary to shake things up. Sometimes you need to agitate, you need to provoke in order to produce change. So we don't want to dismiss that. But there needs to be a background level of broad-based engagement. I think the starting point for that is to avoid messaging that actively alienates. So that does not mean, again, the best way of finding this in truth is by doing good testing. So I think the starting point is actually to go and not even to test, to listen. I'm always amazed how little time my colleagues who are working in climate change communications have spent with people who are not from their own ideological, educational class bubble. It is essential that we spend some time going out and listening to people who are not like us, understanding what works for them, what doesn't work for them, where they're coming from, what their values and concerns are. One of the things I said that was interesting about that work we did with the UK Climate Coalition was it was the first time that anybody had actually gone and tested any of the messaging outside the green bubble. Well, we've had 30 years of doing that, of never asking, does this work? So we can guess what might work. I think it's very good to go and to have that conversation to find out what works. And although this is not about finding messaging which necessarily 100% works, it's avoiding the messaging that does not work. We know, for example, one of the things we can be confident about is that talking about climate change in a broader sense than just environment, generally speaking, works. So I think the starting point should probably be broadening the conversation, bringing in a wider range of voices, speaking in a different way, especially bringing in health issues. There's a lot of crossover in urban areas between climate change issues and air quality issues. Air quality creates a much stronger, more diverse level of attention and engagement. So that is definitely an area where you know, we could look to work. I have to say that there are some of the ways that the climate movement talks about climate change within an intersectional approach of saying, well, climate change cannot be divorced from other issues of social justice, which are actively alienating to people on the right. I don't want ever to say that people don't do what you passionately believe in, but I am warning that there is a corollary, that there's not a corollary, collateral damage that comes with that, is if we constantly talk about climate change only within the context of justice, of economic and social justice, we need to recognize that we are feeding the very thing which pushes people away. So again, I'm not saying this is easy. I don't want anybody to ever not say what they believe. But we need to recognize if that is what is dominating the conversation, there's no countervailing conversation talking about climate change in terms of a different set of values, that what we're doing is we're helping to fuel this idea that you're either with us or you're against us. And this hasn't got us very far. So I would warn that language around certain buzzwords, certain frameworks are potentially fueling polarization. And I have to say, I'm afraid, I think justice is one of those. Fairness is not. So here we see, for example, again, that there are ways maybe that we can convey the sense of what we're talking about without getting those little trigger points where people immediately go, no, I hate this. And interestingly, we've tested language, and this has been done in a wider academic community, where the same content is conveyed using slightly different framing and slightly different words and produces very different responses from different people. So putting in all of our favorite language works for us and whoever we might be, but we need to recognize that then other people might oppose that. So looking very carefully at the language and vocabulary we use.
Thanks, George. So we've got a few more questions. I think we should probably be able to get through two.
I'll get through these very quickly now. I'll give myself 1 minute each.
That's not something that you or I are usually very good at, getting through things. Right, so we have a question here from Ali Rowe, who says, hi there. I work with young activists globally and have a background in mental health. I'm concerned about the internal polarization of young minds. So in the UK, I'm witnessing a disconcerting way that young people are being treated. They are between the wedge of being pathologized or criminalized for having an active voice around the climate and demanding change. What thoughts do you have around these, around those professionals, psychiatrists and police, dealing with these young people?
Oh, thanks for saying that. I think I'd prefer to keep that as a comment because I feel it's outside the bounds of my knowledge. So thank you. Let's just leave it there. Let's just leave it there as a comment. What I would say, though, as I kind of flagged up earlier, is that this idea of polarization, although the most potent and clear one relates to political polarization, I've already flagged up that I think that there's a real potential there for an intergenerational polarization. And on the one hand, I fully support young people's voice and movements in expressing their anger over this. But I'm warning that there is a danger with that it creates, again, this polarization effect, that if we don't find language which reaches across and says, let's do all of this together, that we end up with a situation which reinforces skepticism or reinforces opposition with an older demographic. And we do not have the time to wait for the young people to all come into their own. We have to take everybody with us. And yeah, but in terms of your general point, no, let's just leave it there.
Okay, so we'll just do one more final question on linguistics, and this is certainly something that in my role at Climate Outreach, doing a lot of external engagement and talking to a lot of individuals and organizations, I get this question a lot, so really interested to hear your position, George. So this is from Jim Verosco, and he says, I saw a TV program about US Midwest farmers that were facing the effects of climate change, but were absolutely against explicitly calling it that. What does your research, what does Climate Outreach's research say about calling climate change something different?
So, yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of attempts over the years to try and rename it or not to talk about it. And this has been interestingly, this has been a much more potent conversation in the US, where I think you are much more alert to the power of branding and the power of framing in most countries, where we just like to throw words about whether it should we call it climate change, should we call it global warming? That's one of the things. And then should we call it climate change, should we call it climate crisis, which interestingly is a kind of framing which has really taken off, certainly in Europe. And should we not talk about it at all? Now, that was a view for a while, certainly within the kind of US environmental world, but actually maybe it's better not to talk about climate change at all. And that we would talk about it, we would talk about its impact, we would talk about its impacts, or we would talk about renewable energy, but we wouldn't talk about climate change. And I conceive a temptation to do that. But at some point, that is losing us time, because we do have to talk about this issue. And this is why engagement is so essential. If people don't understand what climate change it is and what's causing it, we're not laying down any of the foundations for longer term policy change. I think, though, when it comes to speaking with rural communities, and we've done some work on this. Of course, we did a lot in Alberta. We've had conversations with rural communities all around the world. I think one of the things which is most important here is the communicator. Really, for working in these communities, the essential thing is to work with, to support, to enable, to empower people within those communities to talk about it. I think also this framework of talking about not climate change, but about the changing climate, about the way that the weather is changing and what the implications are for rural life and for farming economies is a powerful way to go, and of course for extreme weather events. So I don't think it's a bad thing to keep mitigation out of a conversation to begin with, and to focus primarily on, again, the language we were saying, which was not adaptation, but preparation. And yes, you may wish not to talk about climate change. You might wish to talk indeed about like increasing weather extremes or changes in weather, and to avoid those buzzwords. But really, the recommendation was actually probably on this would be to sail straight into the wind and say, yeah, I'm going to call it climate change. That's what it is. But to make sure that the person who's doing that is somebody who has some integrity or basis within that community, and is not seen to be an outsider. And I realize that's hard and challenging. So we need to really reach out to identify and nurture the people who can be voices for different communities.
Thank you very much, George. So on that note, I think we're going to wrap up here. I'm conscious that we've gone about a minute over. Anything final to add, George?
The thing I would like is we have the details of people who signed up for this. We will send you one email in which we will do a follow-up, and we will say, thank you so much, and give the details if you would wish further information from us. We'd be very interested to hear from you. My colleague Joel Silver, I'll put his email up in a moment. Joel, who's speaking here, would be very interested to hear from you. And if there's anybody on this call who has an interest organizationally in joining this wider, major international initiative, the Climate Engagement Initiative, that I just flagged up briefly, we would very much like to hear from you and to start a conversation. This is about to start, and this will get quite larger as major funder support. This is going to get much larger in the course of a year. So anybody who would like to partner with us or work with us on that, we would very much like to hear from you. And on that note, I will share Joel's. There we are, up on the screen now. If we can see that, Joel. That's Joel's email there. Yeah. And please do visit our website for any more information.
Thanks everyone so much for joining. You got my email there. We would love to hear from you if you'd like to continue the conversation. In answer to the final question we just had there, yeah, we have recorded this whole webinar. We will be uploading it to our website, and we'll share it in the follow-up email to everyone who signed up to attend. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of New York Climate Week, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.